Erie's Jewish community has deep ties to World War II. Over 550,000 Jewish Americans fought for equality and tolerance all over the world. These are some of the stories Erie can never forget.
Major funding for GI Jews was provided by
the National Endowment for the Humanities, bringing you the stories that define us.
Additional funding provided by Righteous Persons Foundation, Dobkin Family Foundation, Alexander Wolf & Son, Al Berg, Sumner M. Redstone Charitable Foundation, the Sylvia A. and Simon B. Poita Programming Endowment to Fight Anti-Semitism, Mandel L. and Madeline H. Berman Foundation, River Birch LLC, Marlene and Jaime Mamie, Mass Humanities, Robert and Pamela Jacobs, Jacques and P. Fink Foundation for the Arts, Alan I. Franco, Paler Foundation, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and others. A complete list is available from PBS.
I'm Rabbi Emily Lozman-Ostrov. I am the rabbi of Temple Anshe Hesed here in Erie, Pennsylvania. We have a wonderful historic community, and it's one of the things that makes me so proud to be a rabbi here in Erie, is knowing that the Jewish presence goes back quite a long time. In fact, here at the temple, we can date our cemetery back to 1846, which is on 26th Street, and we are also one of the earliest recognized Reform congregations in the entire country. I'm a very proud granddaughter of two grandfathers who both served in World War II. My paternal grandfather, Edward Losbin, was an infantryman who served in Italy. He landed first in North Africa and then went over and spent the time in Italy, and he was a sharpshooter. I've always heard those stories secondhand from my father and from my grandmother about my paternal grandfather, my Papi Eddie, and his bravery during the war. On my other side, on my maternal side, my maternal grandfather, call him Grandpop Dan, he actually served in the China-Burma India Corps, the CBI, which they often call the Forgotten Theater, and he passed away just last year, just shy of his 92nd birthday, 1 week shy, and so I was blessed for many years to hear great stories about his time in the war. His stories were so unique because he would tell me these stories about being in very far-off places, like being in India and being in Casablanca and also being in Burma. And so my grandfather would tell these great stories of one time, one of his favorite stories to tell was how a Maharaji saw my grandfather and said he looked just like his brother and believed that my grandfather was the reincarnation of his brother and tried to get my grandfather to stay in India and become a prince. And I believe my grandfather thought about it but decided to come back. One of my other early memories with my grandfather is looking at his dog tags. And on his dog tags there was the letter H for Hebrew. And my grandfather, even though he was this Jewish soldier, was still treated like one of the rest of the soldiers. He had shared with me other times in his life where he had experienced anti-Semitism and prejudice just for being Jewish. But in the war, he always said how equal he was. And that to me was really important and really proud of what he did. My grandmother's cousin, her first cousin, Sam Tobin, died as a result of D-Day in Normandy, after storming Normandy. And he had gone to University of Pennsylvania, and when he went off to the war, he wasn't married yet and had no kids. And so the legacy that he left was with his brother, my grandmother's cousin, and my grandmother. And so about 20 years ago, we were at a party, and I was getting ready to go off to live in France for the semester. And my grandmother's cousin, his name is David, or we called him Duddy, he said, you know, when you go to France, I just have one thing to ask. Can you go to Normandy and find my brother's grave? Nobody's been there. Nobody's been able to pay respects. If you can go, you'd be doing that for the whole family. And so in my program, we had a weekend getaway to go to Normandy. I was the first to sign up and paid my deposit right away. And we did lots of other wonderful things, but the only thing I could focus on was getting to see the cemetery. We pulled up, it was a beautiful sunny day, and I went to go into the little house, the little information house, just to make sure, and nobody was there. So I said, okay, I have the numbers that my cousin Dudi had given me. I'm gonna just go find the grave and pay respects in the Jewish tradition and say the Kaddish. And so 3 other friends with me, 4 other friends, we start looking for the grave, and I'm looking at the numbers that I have, and I'm looking at them, and all of a sudden, we get to the end of all the numbers, and it doesn't work. We have a letter that isn't included, and I start panicking. And I said, this is the one thing I said I would do. I'm not leaving, and the bus is getting ready to have us go. I said, I can't leave. If I need to find my way back, I will. And so we frantically start looking at all the Jewish stars in the entire cemetery. And before, as I was being very peaceful and walking slowly and looking, now I'm kind of running a little haphazardly, and my friends, and we're all, and then finally, someone had come back to that house, and with the information, was able to look up to tell me that my cousin, my grandmother's first cousin, Sam Tobin, actually had been interred first, and that cemetery where he had been interred had now become a German cemetery. So the numbers that I had were numbers that they must have gotten very quickly after he had passed, before his permanent interment. And so they gave me the correct numbers, and my friends and I were able to go to my cousin Sam's grave, and we were able to be the first ones from the family and offer the traditional Kaddish prayer of saying the mourner's Kaddish. And it's Jewish tradition to put a little stone or a rock on top of the grave, but because this was an immaculate cemetery, I couldn't find any stones, so the closest thing I could find was some cut grass to just kind of put on there as a way of saying that we were there. And it was a really powerful experience. It's amazing the family connection that I have with regards to the role that my family members played in World War II. Even though I never met my father's father, and I never met the first cousin who passed away after storming Normandy, I feel connected in a sense, not only that I am proud of what they did and proud that they stepped forward to be there for our country, I actually feel that just as they had the role in serving and protecting and helping, I have the obligation and the role to keep their memory alive. And within Judaism, memory is so important. We talk a lot about this notion of lador vador, from generation to generation. And sometimes it's easy to see that we can pass stories down. And one of the reasons we pass the stories down is so that we can also pass on the greatest attributes of those who came before us.
Hi, my name is Jeff Pinsky, and I was born and raised in Erie. I was born in 1944, at the end of 1944, so just at the end, sort of the end of World War II. There was only about 6 months left in the war. I grew up Jewish, and the Bris Shalom congregation, which is a very conservative congregation in Erie. It was one of the 3 major branches of Judaism in Erie. There was Anshe Hesed, which is the Reform branch of Judaism, and at that time there was an Orthodox congregation also in Erie. So there were 3, and it was a vibrant Jewish community in Erie. There was, I don't know if during the war, but after the war, you had a lot of immigrants and refugees, we called them, and a lot of them had been survivors from the camps, the concentration camps, the death camps that were in Poland and Nazi Germany. And many of them then would join the either Anshe Hesed or Bris Shalom. And I remember as a child seeing some of them, and seeing some of them with their tattoos on their wrists. And I would ask, my parents, why are there numbers there? And they just said, well, they're a refugee. And a lot of people didn't want to talk about it. And it was years later before some of these stories would start to get out. And some of them were very heroic and fascinating stories. I was very fortunate in that I worked for the newspaper for 40 years, and I was able to interview a lot of these folks, or be friends with a lot of these folks. I'll give you just a brief example. There was a fellow who was originally from Pittsburgh, but he ended up settling in Erie, and he was a newspaper man. His name was Len Colas. And he was in the war, and he was in France and Germany, and he met this beautiful woman when he was in France, and her name was Suzanne. And of course, French Jew. She had been sent away to the countryside by her family when the Nazis occupied Germany. And when the war was over and she came back, her family was gone. They were all killed. They were dead. They had been taken away to the camps. She was the only one to survive of her family. But then she fell in love with this American GI over there, was going to bring her back to not just to Pittsburgh, but to Erie, Pennsylvania, where he was going to settle. And it took a little while to do that because you had to get papers and cards and such, just like it is today. And she was scheduled to get on that flight and fly to the United States, and everybody was so happy, and they were waiting for her at the airport, and they learned the plane crashed. And everybody aboard that plane was killed, and it was devastating. And 3 or 4 days later, they learned that Suzanne missed that plane. She had been bumped off that flight and survived and was able to come back to Erie, marry Len Colas, start their own family. Len then became the managing editor of the Erie Daily Times in Erie. So just one of these amazing stories that you hear over the years. Well, the Jewish community in Erie has dwindled greatly over the years, over those since the war broke out, say, over 70 years ago. It's down to it's a very, very small community now, and it only has 2 congregations, the Reformed congregation, Anshe Hesed, and the conservative congregation, which is Bris Shalom. Yet they're both very vibrant congregations, and they function independently, but also Jews in Erie have an umbrella organization called the Jewish Community Council of Erie, and that sort of serves as that umbrella organization over the Jews, whether they're affiliated or with a congregation or they're unaffiliated with a congregation. So it's a very, very small community, but it's a very vibrant community as well. Jewish Community Council is formed as that umbrella organization, and is primarily has evolved into an educational aspect, the education of the Holocaust, and bringing that to the community, both the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community, and how important that is. That you see today, Holocaust studies are going on in so many schools, public schools and parochial schools as well. And we do a lot. For instance, we have sent, in the last few years, we've sent over 50 busloads of students. So we have sent them to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, free of charge. But these are life-altering experiences for these kids, because that's it's an amazing place.
I'm Walter Harf. Good afternoon. I was born in Germany, a little town in Germany, and I was born in December 28th, 1928. I had the little town that we lived in, there were 3 Jewish families in it altogether, and that was it. And I was the only Jewish person in the elementary school. And for the first several years, there was no problem. But by the 3rd grade, a person of extreme Nazi thoughts came to the community and became our teacher. He disallowed anyone to play with me. He disallowed anyone to talk to me. I was no longer known by my name. I was now known as the Jude. And so my life changed very dramatically in my 3rd grade, so that I understood a little bit of what was going on. And so leaving for the United States was a wonderful thing as far as we were concerned. I did not know what it was going to be like. On the ship over, it's the first time I'd ever eaten watermelon and celery and some of those other things. And as an 8-year-old, I was delighted running all over that ship and enjoying new foods. When we got to the United States, we were met in New York City by the Joint Distribution Committee and put on a train for Erie, Pennsylvania. Because my father had been put away for the Nazis because we were Jewish, he realized it was time to get out. Prior to that, I had an uncle who left Germany also, my father's brother. And when we realized the situation as bad as it was, we first got my mother's parents out, then a first cousin of mine, and then we came out in October of 1937. Fortunately, we had family in Erie, so we came to Erie. My first day at school was October 28th, 1938 at Jefferson. And people were wonderful to me. I could not speak a word of English, and very few there I would understand spoke German. There was a teacher by the name of Miss Sullivan, Alice Sullivan, who also did not speak German, and I didn't speak English. But she and I got along so well that within a year, I spoke English without an accent, but I don't think she spoke any German. So my experience at Jefferson was great. My grandfather was also there. And I've learned since that on July 22nd, 1942, my grandfather was put on a train, went to Theresienstadt, and unfortunately went from there to Auschwitz. And in an area almost the size of Erie County, I would say, he was the absolute last Jew in that whole area. The Germans insisted that he handed over the keys to the synagogue, which was in the next community, and for, I think, 1,000 marks. And that was the end of Jewry. They called, the day after this July 22nd date that I mentioned, the newspaper in the area said that it was Judenrein, which meant void of all Jews, and it's completely now cleared of Jews. He was the last Jew in the whole area. So that's the sad part that I learned afterwards. But my grandparents I knew well, of course. They lived almost next door to us. So part of the history that I know was not because I was there, but because I learned of it afterwards. Life in Erie was always wonderful. Very much so because of Temple Anshe-Hesed. We were welcomed here immediately. And became a part of this community, and ended up being a very important part of our community here. My mother became president of the sisterhood. She ended up being a national person on that board, and I've been president of the congregation, and so we've been busy.
I was born in Rochester, New York, but I lived almost all the rest of my life in Erie. And at this point, I'm 95 years old, and fortunately or unfortunately, I did not serve in the armed forces. I was declared a 4F because of a health problem, and that's very regretful for me. But fortunately, being here in Erie, and almost all of my friends serving in the armed forces, I was able to do some things here for them when they were on leave and came home. There was a society of young Jewish men called the AZA, Aleph Zadok Aleph, and I was part of that. And we had regular meetings, and we kept track of each other pretty well before the war. And after the war started, that's where this thing evolved, trying to keep track of where all the olives were. Sort of a diary, for lack of a better word, of where they were, what they were doing, what their rank was. And I have page after page after page of every GI we could find here in Erie, and telling about where they were, what their addresses, and sort of a memo about all the various GIs. Here's a photograph of one of them. One thing we have of some GIs that were involved before and after. Some of them were in uniform, some were not yet in uniform. So that's an example of what I was doing, not serving, but serving in Erie. But we kept pretty close track of them, everybody we could find, and kept them informed with knowing where their fellow GIs were, what they were doing, and any kind of messages we have to pass along. I thought it was sort of interesting and valuable at the same time. So they were not alone completely. They had other friends and neighbors who were serving, and here's where they are, here's where George is, and here's where somebody else is. And so it was, I thought, a sort of a valuable kind of a thing.
My name is Mark Tenenbaum. I'm Erie native. I was born here. Both my parents were born here, and they were married when they were 21 years old. They had a child, my oldest brother, Roy, and who is 15 or 16 years older than I am. And so he was born during the United States involvement with World War II. My dad had a scrapyard in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania at that time. Owning a scrapyard prohibited you from being in the Army because it was a necessary occupation to get scrap metal in for the war effort. So if you owned a scrapyard, it was a draft deferment. But Dad wanted to go into the Army, and he ended up selling his scrapyard so that he would now be eligible, and he joined. He joined the Army. But, he thought, he was this young kid, from Erie, Pennsylvania, and he thought that it was all for one and one for all, and that we're all American soldiers, and they were all going to go fight the Nazis together. And, I think that when he came head on to, systematic anti-Semitism in the United States Army, that it really hurt him, and it isolated him. They sent him out all the time to be on point. And then as the lines changed, my dad was trapped behind the lines in a mortar hole. He tells the story he was with some other guy, and the guy was injured, and they were bandaging up his hand when that guy was hit in the head and died, like in close proximity to my father. So my dad was left overnight, in this foxhole with this, deceased comrade, and behind enemy lines, and he ultimately, just by luck, I guess, found his way back. Later on, to end that story, the guy was actually, his commanding officer was actually from Pittsburgh, and years later, the guy came to Erie and found my father and apologized, and my father accepted his apology and again moved on. One of the interesting things is that my uncle Monty, my uncle Morris, we called him Monty, he was also in the Army. They had my mother, Cecilia, and my Aunt Rookie, Rose, her name was Rose, but we called her Rookie. And so my Aunt Rookie and my mother were these young brides with both a new child. So they had very little money to raise their family, and so my Aunt Rookie closed her house down and moved in with my mother, and the two women raised their boys and swapped. One week one would clean and take care of the house, and the other week, and that week the one other woman would do the shopping and all the cooking, and then they would swap each week, and so they weren't stepping on each other's toes, and so they worked out a deal. And the truth is, those two women were ridiculously tight as a result of that. Although they were not sisters, they were sisters-in-law. But they had a camaraderie and a bond that lasted all of their lives, well into their 80s and 90s. I mean, the other great Jewish story, that Dad talks about, it was spring, and he had lost track of days, so he didn't know what the calendar day was. And so he didn't know it was Passover, which was a big deal. But he said that somebody came through, like a colonel, and knew he was, knew the Jews in his area. He was the only one in his particular small group. But they got him, and he said, "Okay, you get in the truck," and they shipped him off in a truck. And he didn't know where he was going or what was happening, but he ended up. It was Seder night. All these Jews from all over the country, of the United States, and gathered in from all the Italian campaign. And the United States Army put a Seder on, for all these boys. And they sang the songs and they ate the food. So he was very grateful for that.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dennis Vidmar of Erie, Pennsylvania, originally from Cleveland, Ohio. Yeah, my father, Frank J. Vidmar of Cleveland, Ohio, was a veteran of World War II. He was in the United States Army. He was a Signal Corps specialist, in today's parlance a Spec 5, I believe, in the 714th Tank Battalion of the 12th Armored Division. He shipped out for Europe in the summer of 1944. This was after D-Day landings at Normandy had occurred. They were part of that totally green, had not seen combat group that was sent to guard a very, very thin line in December of 1944, which later became known the Ardennes campaign, otherwise known as the Battle of the Bulge. My father's unit was not actually in the direct Battle of the Bulge, but they were on the far south of this. As the Nazis realized that they were getting defeated, they formed a diversionary attack further south, which they called Operation Northwind, and that was right in the teeth of the 12th Armored Division where my father fought. Okay, full disclosure here. My father, good Catholic boy from the east side of Cleveland, went into combat and survived the rigors thereof, but had a profound effect on me personally, and certainly was one of my reasons for coming to Judaism as a 21-year-old. So my father's outfit were one of the outfits that liberated the subcamps of Dachau, which I found out only when I was about 10 years old, when my father actually told me about it. My father died at age 44, so he never really had a chance to come clean with me, my mom, or my siblings about his wartime experiences, except for this one. When they went into the camps, they saw starving people. I mean, literally walking skin and bones in their garb, the striped suits, longitudinally striped suits. And my father relates that the prisoners there, now liberated because the Nazi captors had left, they pointed. All these people either spoke Polish or Yiddish or whatever, maybe German, but they certainly didn't speak English, but they all were pointing. So my father's group went towards the back of the camp, and there was this big mound of dirt. So the unit brought in a backhoe, a mechanical backhoe, and started pulling earth, and then they uncovered a mass grave. And that affected him profoundly. In his later work experience, when he was working at Picker X-ray, there was a seminal event which I heard about only later from one of my father's friends. Actually, it was his boss. In the office where he worked, because he was an engineer, there was a gentleman, and I don't know his own ethnicity, but he was starting to throw out a lot of racial epithets against blacks, Jews, and, whatevers. And my father, having seen what he saw in Europe in World War II, said, no, wait a minute. We just got through fighting a war on principles about this. How can you, as a person this was probably about 1961 or 62, say things like this? And so he started to pick a fight with my father, which was a mistake because my dad, unlike myself, was 6'2" and about 230 pounds and quite muscular. So my father just stood there and said, fine, take a swing. So the guy took a swing at him. My father decked him. So guy's lying on the floor, kind of stunned, and the boss walks in. The boss being a very, very soft-spoken gentleman who spoke with a German accent. So the boss asked, okay, what's going on here? What's going on? Well, Frank Vidmar decked this guy. All right. Well, what happened? So the co-workers came clean and said, well, they were egging him on, and he was saying pretty nasty things about Jews, blacks, etc. And the boss said, well, who took the first swing? I said, he did. And Frank decked him. So he looked at the guy on the floor and said, you, pack your desk, you're out of here now. And then he rolled up his sleeve, and there tattooed was a concentration camp number from the Nazis. His name was Alex Weiss, and my father and he had just been boss and subordinate, but at that point they became friends. So at my father's funeral in January of 1965, quote, Uncle Alex, who became a friend of our family, sat me down and he said, your father was what we call a mensch, and you need to be like him. Your father would have been a good Jew. And those were words that stuck.